Let's talk about what goes into overhead movement. Overhead movement is really commonly seen in the gym because it is effective, it's challenging, it's versatile, and it's super fun. Maybe not for everybody, but for me, it is super fun. So the overhead movement, even though it has all these benefits, has this reputation of shoulder pain, upper body injuries. So there are so many different parts of the upper body and joints that are involved in overhead movement, like the mid back or the thoracic spine, even all the way up into the neck, the scapula or shoulder blades, and even the elbow and the wrist play a part in overhead movement. So if you guys have questions about any of those joints and how they play a part in overhead movement specifically, just go ahead and drop some comments below, and I can also create videos on those specific joints in that overhead articulation as well. But today we are specifically focusing on the shoulders and the role that they play in the overhead game. So shoulders, they can be victims of overhead injury and pain because of an imbalance or a weakness or lack of range of motion in another part of the body, like the spine or the scapula. They can also be the driver of injury or pain for that overhead work. We are going to talk about what goes into a healthy shoulder when we talk about overhead movement specifically, and how to improve those ranges of motion and that movement of the shoulder to hopefully prevent future injuries and pains. When we are talking about the health of the shoulder, generally, we are talking about the rotator cuff. Now, the rotator cuff is the innermost part of that shoulder joint. It wraps around the shoulder just like a cuff, and it attaches to the scapula. So you can think of the scapula as the root of the shoulder. The four muscles that make up the rotator cuff are the subscapularis in front, and then we have three muscles in the back: the infra and supraspinatus muscles, and then the teres minor muscle. So those four muscles, and in addition to the ligaments and tendons that make up the rotator cuff, make up the health of the shoulder. They are responsible for stability and rotation of that shoulder joint. So stability and rotation are the fundamental movements of the shoulder joint. You are not going to have optimal overhead movement if the shoulder is not rotating and stabilizing with that rotator cuff in an efficient way. Now let's talk about what's on top of that, the cap of the shoulder, the juicy part of the shoulder, which is the delts. So we have the anterior or front delt, we have the side or lateral delt, and then in the back we have the posterior or rear delt. These are the muscles that are in charge of pushing weight overhead. So these muscles, if they're not developed enough, can once again rely on other surrounding muscle groups or joints to get the job done, therefore putting other joints at risk of injury, including the shoulder and deeper within the shoulder, the rotator cuff. So let's talk about the roles that each of these parts of the shoulder play. We'll use some quick examples, and feel free to follow along so you can feel these examples as I show them. So let's talk about stability first. So even before rotation, the rotator cuff is going to stabilize the shoulder joint. So if you grab something like a stick, you can do this with a light dumbbell, but the stick is nice because we can change the lever length of that stick pretty easily. It's got some weight to it. It's just a little bit more awkward to hold than a dumbbell. So that's why I like using it as an example. You can also use an Indian club or something like that that's a little offset. So if you grab the stick right in the center, and then you lengthen that lever, hold it away from you, we are activating the rotator cuff to stabilize the shoulder joint. Now, as you're holding this here, we want to make sure that the shoulder is not compensating, it's not cheating. So if the shoulder starts to lift up, if we start to lean away from that stick here, that's the body compensating to make the job easier. That's not to say that those compensations are incorrect or wrong, but if we're focusing on strengthening and finding the rotator cuff specifically, then we want to isolate it as much as possible. So pull the shoulder down, make sure you're not leaning away from that arm, and the longer you hold here, the heavier it's going to feel. So we are stabilizing the shoulder by using that rotator cuff, and this is the most fundamental movement of that rotator cuff. Now, one of the muscles could be stronger than the other. There could be, if you're recovering from a rotator cuff tear, that's talking about the ligaments within that rotator cuff. So this could be very challenging if you are just returning to movement of the shoulder. So let's try to change up that lever length a little bit and slide that stick so now it's parallel to the ground. So now we have a larger surface area for gravity to press down on, which is going to make it feel like it's heavier. So we're still holding it out here. And you can feel some like vibrations deep within that shoulder. That is your rotator cuff stabilizing that shoulder joint. So you can play with all kinds of rotations. You can change the length of that lever, noticing how that challenges different areas of the shoulder, even all the way down through the elbow, forearm, and wrist and hand. And then let's try to abduct the arm from the shoulder. So now we're reaching to the side and we're going to feel a little bit more of that posterior side of the rotator cuff, now also stabilizing the stick as it's to the side. So now I kept my stick parallel to the ground, but you could also turn that back to perpendicular. Now, when we do all of these shoulder movements, is the rotator cuff the only muscle group that's working here? Absolutely not. We are also working the delts, which we are going to talk more in depth about in a few minutes. The traps, which also play a part in overhead work, the pecs as well, the lats, the serratus anterior. So many muscle groups working here to help aid with this movement, but the main goal is to just feel that shoulder start to get tired. So we can even do this with shoulder extension. So if you bring that arm down by your side, or you could just simply reach around behind you, we can feel the stability of that shoulder in extension as well. So I've got my stick straight up. I could also internally rotate that shoulder, reaching the palm up towards the ceiling, challenging the stability this way. We can change the lever length. So many different ways to challenge this rotator cuff as we are just stabilizing this position. Now the tendency is going to be to lean forward. So we want to try to take away any of those compensations there. All right, so let's just do the other side just for fun. Don't have to do it for as long. We're just trying to activate that rotator cuff and feel it working. So we can go right away to a longer lever, something a little bit more challenging. If you want to challenge more of the medial side, the side closer to the middle of your body, you can slide that stick over towards the middle of your body. If you wanted to try challenge more of the lateral side, you could slide the end of that stick towards the other side of the body. And then we can change to the side. So now we can abduct that arm from the shoulder. Just noticing how that shoulder is going to support and stabilize this position. And then we can go over to extension. We can also do palm down back here in extension. Once again, making sure that we're not leaning forward. No compensations here. We're just trying to stabilize and release. So let's work on that rotation, which is everybody's favorite. So let's come down to the floor, or you can stay standing. You can grab a door frame. You could do this against a wall, but you're not going to get as much external rotation out of it. So I'm going to keep my stick and I'm going to reach over top with my left hand driving down, and the stick is going to be just outside of my right thigh or your right hip if you're standing. And you're going to kind of thread that right arm through, pressing the back of that right arm against the stick. Then you're going to bend your elbow at 90 degrees. So in this setup, you want to make sure that the right elbow is right in front of the right shoulder. And we're just going to explore internal and external rotation of the shoulder. So when we talk about improving the stability of the shoulder, then we are going to work on the movements that we just did, increasing the time under tension, increasing the load. I'll show you a bonus exercise at the end that also addresses shoulder stability. Those ones are pretty easy to progress. When it comes to rotation, these movements are more difficult to progress because we are working with mobility. So we are going to also increase time under tension and the tension that we use. It's just going to be a little bit harder to find. So when we talk about internal rotation, which is fist reaching down towards the floor here, we are rotating the humerus, which is the upper arm bone right here, into internal rotation. And yes, you do need internal and external rotation when we do overhead movements. So the internal rotation, the shoulder is going to internally rotate at the top of the movement, right? I'll show you. So as I press overhead, my humerus is going into internal rotation this way. As I pull that arm down, no matter which variation of press, if I'm doing a single arm dumbbell press, I'm gonna need to externally rotate. Let's say we're doing a press here like this, out in front. I internally rotate that arm at the top, and as I come down, I externally rotate. We always talk about in overhead movements, the elbow needs to be under the wrist. This is the most optimal position for force production straight overhead, and it puts that shoulder in external rotation. If we have that shoulder externally rotated, if we have a good handle on that external rotation and can produce force in that movement, which happens at the rotator cuff, then we will be able to press more movement or more weight overhead, period. So back to our capsule cars. So we go into internal rotation, dropping that forearm and fist below the elbow. And in order to increase this movement, we can increase the load, we can increase the time under tension, we can increase the actual tension that we are using. We can use isometrics here, we can use liftoffs and holds. So many different options, but right now we are just exploring these two articulations. So just notice which one may seem a little bit easier, which one may seem a little bit more difficult. This movement specifically is really going to get into the front of the rotator cuff, or that internal rotation, that subscapularis muscle that we talked about in front of the scapula. So you want to think about, if you can imagine that front of the scapula, just trying to drive that fist down towards the floor. And then let's switch sides. So now the right hand is going to go over top, stick is outside that left leg, thread that left arm through. We're bent at 90 degrees. Now the stick is really here for you to press into and just to keep that upper arm bone still. So the humerus bone is going to be rotating on its axis here. We are not moving that arm and that elbow all around. Once again, the name of the game as we go through our rotations is isolation. We're isolating the rotation of the humerus bone from that shoulder joint. And yes, we need both for overhead movements. And over to external. Try to increase that tension, pushing out into that stick. And we'll go one more time. Driving down a little bit further. And over to external. All right, so that's some exploration of our internal and external rotation. Now let's see some internal, external from an abducted position. So this is really going to help us feel that external rotation a little bit more in the posterior side of the rotator cuff, the back side. So you're going to back your back up against a wall. Elbows are going to be straight out from the shoulders this time, from the side. So we're going to get a lot of thoracic extension, mid-back extension in this movement, because we're going to also press the back of the head into the wall. These are super common going to external rotation from here, or wall slides. So again, we are just rotating the humerus on its axis. Make sure, especially as we go into internal rotation, that the shoulders do not come away from the wall. Shoulders are still pressed back into the wall. And then we're going to go back into external. And here's where you're really going to feel the posterior side of the rotator cuff working to press those hands back. And like I said, there's so many different ways to increase this range of motion that, again, I can address in another video, and I may have already addressed some of that in some of my previous videos, but just drop any questions down in the comments and I will address those questions. Let's try one more here. So tight fists, working to pull into internal rotation, the front of the rotator cuff, and then we'll pull into external rotation, the back of the rotator cuff, and rest. All right, so that's your rotator cuff, very simply explained. We got the stability of the shoulder and we got the rotation of the shoulder. So now let's talk about the strength of the shoulder, the muscles that we usually talk about when building our shoulders, the front, side, rear delts. So very simply, if you want to think about strengthening the front delts, we're going to do a front raise. You're going to raise dumbbells up right in front of you. We are not using momentum to do this movement. We are just using the shoulders to lift and lower. As you lift, the elbows don't need to be perfectly straight or extended. We're moving with control, but you don't need to hold at the top for too long. We're just trying to feel those muscles working and get some fatigue going there, just to feel what those muscles are doing and how those muscles feel. So front raises are great for building anterior delts. The best way of building anterior delts is an overhead press. So we're getting there, don't worry. But this is just this very simple way to feel it. So let's try 2 more. Don't need to go very heavy with these, especially since we are working on using as little compensation as possible and as little momentum as possible. For working the side or lateral delts, we are lifting into a lateral raise. So once again, keeping the elbows slightly bent, we're gonna lift up. So now you're gonna feel the top and sides of the shoulders lifting the dumbbells up and controlling them down. That's your lateral delts. Lateral delts are also involved in our overhead press. The rear delts are more for support in the overhead press, but we are going to feel those delts anyway after we finish our set of 10 here with the lateral dumbbell raises. Working the side and top of the shoulder. The shoulder is a complex joint just like the hip. We have a lot of rotation in the shoulder joints. We have a lot of connective tissue in the shoulder joints, a lot of ligaments coming through. It's just a complex joint. Shoulders and hips are very similar, just like ankles and wrists are very similar. Elbows and knees are very similar. All right, so now let's go into our rear delts reverse fly. So in from our hinge position, again, slightly bending those elbows. We're going to really load up the rear delts with this one. Another great way to work the rear delts is a face pull. One of my favorites for the rear delts. Very simple. We're just pulling a cable towards your face, elbows out to the side. And because we're addressing overhead movement specifically, and talking about these muscle groups and how they're involved in that, these movements are not just for bodybuilders. Like I said, all of these muscle groups are important with our overhead movement. So if we want a stronger overhead movement, we should also do the accessory work as if we want a stronger overhead movement. So we should also work the anterior, lateral, and posterior delts individually. So now let's put it all together. So going back to the rotator cuff, we can also address shoulder stability in the overhead position. So now that our shoulders are really warmed up, let's grab our short stick again, and we're gonna see how far we can reach that arm overhead actively. So when we talk about overhead movement, we're going through shoulder flexion. So we're reaching our arm overhead, trying to get your bicep next to your ear. And what we don't want is compensations in the spine, the rib cage flaring or the spine arching or sitting into the low back, protruding of the neck. Any sort of movement of the body, we want to try to avoid, and we want to isolate that arm from the shoulder as much as possible. Now, if your elbow starts to bend or if you feel those compensations, that's basically going to be your shoulder flexion, and that's going to be it. So we can hold this overhead position, whatever is your angle of shoulder flexion. So let's say you're working to get that overhead movement again. You can grab a lightweight, something like this. You could even change the lever length so it's a little bit easier to hold. And we're just gonna hold this position. We are strengthening the rotator cuff in this articulation, which is overhead. So like I said, we could do the overhead movement with the stick straight up and down, or we can change that lever. We can even change the rotation of the arm at the top by rotating that palm forward. And the longer you're in this position, the more you're gonna be working the stability of that shoulder. And slowly bring that arm down. Let's try that on the other side as well. So we can have more shoulder flexion on one side versus the other. I like to cue this rib cage down here as I go overhead with control. Make sure that elbow stays all the way straight. Again, we can change the lever here. So palm can face in. We could turn that lever sideways. We can go straight up and down, which makes it a little bit easier to hold. But the longer we hold up in this shoulder flexion position, the more challenging it is for that rotator cuff, since we are just working that stability. All right. So now that we found kind of where or what we're working with in terms of shoulder flexion, let's see if we can activate that or increase that. So let's go in from a seated position. You can do this against a wall, but I'm going to use my 2 sticks. We're gonna reach up tall and fall the chest forward into a passive shoulder flexion. So I'm gonna bring my chest down towards the floor and let my arms come up overhead. Now this is passive. I'm allowing my rib cage to flare a little bit. I'm overarching my mid back just a little bit, but this is also gonna show you how the influence of the mid back can increase that shoulder movement. So thoracic extension is really, really important when it comes to overhead movement as well. So getting back to the shoulders, let's drive the sticks into the floor and pull that rib cage back and in so that we have an extended mid back, but not hyper extended. We're gonna slide the hands down just a little bit and we're gonna isometrically drive those sticks into the floor. So now we're gonna use the more supportive muscles when it comes to shoulder flexion, like the traps. The traps are the muscles that run all the way from your neck and connect down into your mid back. When you feel like upper shoulder and neck tightness, that's usually your traps that you're feeling there. Traps, you're gonna feel your pecs working here, and your lats as well. Even that anterior serratus muscle, which is down in front of the rib cage here. Those are all supporting muscles in our overhead press as well that we didn't really talk about too much yet. So we're driving those sticks down into the floor. Keep driving the left stick down and see if you can lift the right stick without moving anything. We're gonna hold, 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 and bring that right stick down. If you could not lift, slide those hands down a little bit more so that the arms are a little more in front of you. And then when you lift up with that left stick, we're just trying to lift that bicep closer and closer to the ear. And hold. And bring that arm down and stick down. Now let's try with the right. Lift and hold. So because we're pitched forward like the reverse fly and down, we're working against more gravity here in order to lift up into that shoulder flexion position. So this is a harder shoulder flexion than if you were standing completely upright. And down. And let's do one more. This is a really great overhead movement prep, because we're getting into that passive range to start, and then we're actively working in that shoulder flexion active range, but without weight, so that it's safe, and that we're also really making sure we're targeting the muscles that we need to be targeting in order to achieve an optimal overhead position. So at the end of those three, you can just relax into that passive position again, and then slowly come on out of it. That's basically it for our overhead movement with shoulders. All of these can be done before you do your overhead strength training work. We're just gonna do one more bonus for shoulder stability in that shoulder flexion position. So now we're gonna go in and out of that shoulder flexion now that we know what it is and challenge the stability. You could do this with a weight as well. We're just gonna do a half kneeling windmill. So we're gonna reach one arm up overhead to your max shoulder flexion. We'll open that the front leg just slightly, and then we're gonna reach the hips up and back for a windmill. Now, as you do that, we're gonna rotate the shoulder slightly. So the palm is gonna turn in towards that right knee. We're gonna sit that left hip towards the left heel. So now I'm in more of a shoulder abducted position here. And then we're gonna come back up, hips underneath you, squeeze the bicep next to your ear for that shoulder flexion position, and you can turn that palm back in towards the center of your body. So we're just working the stability of the shoulder in a different way, where we're keeping the arm perpendicular to the ceiling, but moving the body around it. And then come on back up. And then let's try that one more time, going into that half kneeling windmill, leaning the body away from the weight. The shoulder has got to stabilize that position as you're leaning away and as you're moving. Squeeze the bicep next to the ear, and then we can switch sides. So now the left leg is in front. We're reaching up to shoulder flexion, opening that left knee. And then from here, we're gonna hinge that right hip towards the right heel and rotate. So now the palm is facing almost towards that left knee, stabilizing that shoulder. You're gonna feel a lot of lats here as well to try to keep that shoulder away from the ear. As you come back up, we're gonna squeeze that bicep next to the ear. Let's do that 2 more times. Going down. And back up, stabilizing that shoulder with those rotator cuffs and squeezing that bicep next to the ear, leaning the body away from that left arm and back up. Awesome. Nice work. I hope you learned something about the shoulder, the role the shoulder plays in overhead movement. I hope your shoulders are feeling really great. Like I said, drop questions in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.